Hi, thanks for joining me. I'm Sandra Brown with the Institute for Relational Harm Reduction and Public Pathology Education. I'm also the current president of the Association for Narcissistic Personality Disorder and Psychopathy Survivor Treatment. That is an organization to train therapists in this model of care that has been developed from decades of evidence-based research and treatment approaches. So, the goal of the association is to get more trained therapists out there. So this has been a series that I've been doing. I'm going to put the links below this to the other parts of the theory, or the other parts of this series. The first one that I did, which will, if you listen to that, it'll tell you sort of the concept of why this series, and it's called Introduction and What I Meant. And I felt it necessary to begin to talk about things that are happening out there in around this issue of narcissistic and psychopathic abuse or toxic relationships, pathological love relationships. And the reason is that these books launched the field that is now become narcissistic abuse. And so Women Who Love Psychopaths Inside the Relationships of Inevitable Harm was the first book that talked about the intimate relationship parts of the relationship and how those are different than just bad relationships, and sort of the dangers of being with someone that has reduced conscience. Yes, there are other books on narcissism, for instance, or psychopathy, but this was the first book to really look at the intimate relationship and the relationship dynamics, and a lot of assumptions about the survivors who could be in relationships with them. And so that was the first book. The second book, second edition, same book, it's expanded, Women Who Love Psychopaths Inside the Relationships of Inevitable Harm with Psychopaths, Sociopaths, and Narcissists. So more in depth in information about the trauma. And the number one symptom that we identified in our research years ago as cognitive dissonance, which is the hallmark fingerprint that is seen in all survivors. If they don't have cognitive dissonance, they were probably in a bad relationship, but they probably weren't in a pathological relationship with cluster Bs or psychopaths. And then the last book, Women Who Love Psychopaths, same title, much more information, 422 pages, that includes our research with Purdue University, and a lot of the data collections and information that we have been collecting over the years. So part of the reason that we are doing this series is to speak out because of what is getting drastically off course. I don't know where people are coming up with some of the stuff that's out there, but it's not from the research, the data, the science that we do know. I've spent 30 years in this field, only in this field, collecting I think to date, and if I'm wrong, somebody correct me, of the most data collections and information and science and research and survivor symptom surveys and studies on survivor trauma that is out there. you know, that I've been working and collecting information over 30 years. And so we do have good science. We have the makings of a new counseling genre, but we're screwing it up. And we're telling things that we don't have information on, or we're taking the concepts that we do have good understanding of, evidence-based stuff, and survivors and coaches and bloggers are just adding to that without any evidence. And it's problematic. So that's why I've decided to do this series. So in the last video, I talked about the issue of no contact and what people are starting to publish out there that I think, as the theory developer in this emerging counseling genre, that I think they have wrong. And so listen to that to know what I'm going to be building off of that today. And so, you know, keeping up with this issue of, about what's quoted everywhere as NC, or no contact, which is a very important element that we've, you know, talked about on our website, and over 400 articles that we've written about this, and in our books and radio shows. So it's not that we haven't touted and introduced that the first step in this recovery has to be no contact. And the last video went into all the reasons about that. So today I want to expand on that. And so I wrote an article. I don't think I have the exact title of it here. So I wrote an article about that it's not just about no contact. It's about disengagement. And so, you know, everybody touts and writes about the benefits of no contact, and which makes it sound like that what no contact is blocking this person on your phone and social media. And for obvious reasons, for safety reasons, in order to create, you know, some physical distance that creates emotional distance, all the reasons that we know that this no contact. But it's really much more about the issue of disengagement. And so this is a hard concept for a lot of survivors. And the little bit that I have spent in other social media groups on this topic, in narcissistic or psychopathic abuse. And I introduce, you know, this concept of disengagement. They normally have a really big adverse reaction to it. And so disengagement, it is a fine line in recovery. And so there's a necessary place, and I write about this in all of our stuff in our Living Recovery program, or online trauma reduction program, in the books, in the articles, that part of what has to happen in recovery is pathology education, that survivors need to understand the disorder of their partner, which really helps to facilitate this no concept when people really understand the low treatability of these disorders and how little change really happens and the dangerousness of that. And so there's a fine line about getting enough pathology education in order to have the understanding about what you're in, what the relationship was, the danger of that, and what you're going to seek recovery for. And so, but what ends up happening kind of as a loophole to this no contact is that while they're not having contact with the agent of their destruction or the traumatic person in their life, is that they're having lots of contact, triggering contact, setting off their fight and flight, because 75% of them have a trauma disorder, acute stress disorder, PTSD, complex PTSD, one of those. And so while they're not, you know, having contact with him, they're having lots of contact with the drama of it. They're telling their story over and over on social media. They are reading other survivors' stories that are just like them. Well, the mechanics of trauma is that what we do know about triggering is that when survivors who aren't well regulated and haven't had treatment for their trauma, where they know how to pull themselves out of a trigger, for instance, when they are exposed to things that are similar to their own experience, that it causes autonomically, which is another word for automatically, for their fight and flight system, you know, to rev up. And so we had lots of survivors, you know, that came to us in emergencies from binging on these social media sites, trying to get enough information to understand the storyline of their own experience. But these sites are not trauma-informed care. So trauma-informed care would never allow or have a site that did the thing that we know about trauma that causes triggering, and that is, you know, being really submerged into something that reminds you of your own situation. So that could be your storyline and it triggers yourself, or it could be reading other people's stories that are just like yours. And so in a weird kind of way, for people who have training and advanced training in trauma, is that, you know, we recognize kind of the compulsive behaviors in untreated trauma that seek out, and it seems like an oxymoron to seek out something that causes triggering. And it's not that they're seeking it to get triggered. They're just naturally driven to trying to reduce the anxiety that they feel. And they think, you know, reading more information will help. Well, it would help if it was trauma-informed care information, which is the information on the disorder without the storyline, without the drama, without the stuff that will trigger an unregulated and untreated survivor. So they continue. So while they're not having, you know, contact with him, and they can say, I've been no contact 3 months, 3 weeks, and 3 days, but they haven't. They've had lots of contact with their story over and over again, and with other people's stories. So they're still having contact with the agent of their trauma. Not, might not be the person, but it's enough of a connection to their trauma for it to be triggering. And that's what triggers, are. And so it's a fine line when survivors go looking to try to figure out, what this partner has, or what the type of relationship they were in, or what type of trauma they have. They have to go out there and begin reading. But these bloggers and survivors and coaches, social media sites are largely just allowing, people to tell their stories, which on the surface looks like validation and support. And for people that are further along in their recovery and have better trauma reduction skills, they actually have learned some things in therapy, those sites might be okay and not trigger them. But very often it's the new survivor who is raw and highly traumatized that is going and seeking information, and they land on these sites by survivors who, of course, are not trained in trauma-informed care. They're not trauma professionals. They're just on there telling their story over and over, as is everyone else. And so we've had lots of emergency sessions with survivors who got in those rooms, and it jacked up, their adrenaline and cortisol, and they didn't sleep for days. And, it's like the domino effect that, once that fight or flight system gets revved up, all the dominoes begin to fall. And so people can, decompensate very quickly. And so, it's a hard discussion to have, because on the surface, for a lot of survivors, it seems like an oxymoron that I need support and validation and I need information. But there are ways to do that. For instance, our site, our Facebook page, which is the Institute for Relational Harm Reduction, is a trauma-informed site. Survivors can go there and be guaranteed they will never be triggered. They are given excessive, great, accurate information on cluster B and disorders and psychopathy. They're given lots of information on the relationship dynamics, everything they need to know. They're given detailed information on their trauma and what they should do about it and where they should go to get treatment. And they can go on there and know that they're going to get everything they need without the stuff that triggers them, and that we don't engage in connection to things that will traumatize them, and that their autonomic nervous system will automatically associate with their own trauma. And so we are a forward-facing trauma treatment program, meaning not only are we trauma-informed care, and that not only do we know the things that help people in trauma, but more importantly, we understand the mechanics of how trauma works, and we don't do the things that is known in trauma mechanics that cause people to decompensate. And so our forward-facing, trauma is that we deal with the here and now, and we give information, trauma reduction information, trauma education, pathology education, and a lot of specifics about these relationships without the storyline. Because the biggest belief is that the true no contact is to disengage from the agent, of your trauma. And a lot of that trauma is hidden and buried in your storyline. And that story is really important. In fact, it's so important that that story and the details of what happened in your relationship needs to be brought into a trauma-trained therapist, so that when you are telling that story and you begin to feel that fight or flight, that you are becoming triggered by your own memory and description and talking about it, that therapist can work with that memory right in that moment, to help you learn regulation skills. So the next time that maybe you have to tell that story, not that you choose to, but maybe you have to tell it at your medical doctor to get medication for something, that you are able to not trigger yourself. Well, that's not what happens on social media. All telling of your story is not therapeutic. And so survivors are not disengaging with the agent of their trauma when they are on sites that, as they tell the story, they are not being worked with to reduce the reaction that they're getting. And a lot of survivors don't realize that they are getting a reaction. A lot of them argue with me about this and say, I don't feel anything. Well, part of trauma is being really numbed out. And the other thing about trauma is that the reactions of that could happen hours or a couple of days later. And so they're not connecting that. But the bigger issue of all of this is that no contact is more than no contact with the former partner. It is beginning to disengage with things that cause your trauma to increase. And maybe that's friends or family that are triggering to you, or maybe it's being on non-trauma informed care survivor coacher sites, kind of things, that this idea of no contact has to be seen more within the issue of disengagement with all things that are connected to the memory that triggers. So, a lot of survivors will say, I've been no contact 3 months, 3 weeks, 3 days, and yet they are doing flybys on his social media page, or they're doing flybys on his new girlfriend's site, or they're still talking to his family members, or they're driving by the house, or they're still having contact with the agent of their trauma. So it's not just about no contact with the person. You have to begin no contact and disengagement with the memories of the stuff that trigger. And yes, no, you can't just wake up one day and say, I'm not going to have that memory, because we know the memories are coming. But it's important for you to understand what makes trauma worse. And in these cases, and from all the research from all these years, it is that this compulsive need to read and understand that is fulfilled in the wrong ways and the wrong places. The need is correct. You need that education, you need pathology ed, you need trauma ed, you need all that. But it is where you are going to get it, because you are not remaining in no contact with the agent of your trauma. And you'll read anywhere on social media where survivors will break, no contact. They talk, they get back together, maybe they text, and then they're back on these sites saying what a wreck they are, how they shouldn't have done that. Well, survivors get triggered all the time, not just from contact, but from this issue about not having disengagement with the agent of their trauma. And so I just want to put that out there, that from our research, that's, part of what is in our articles that we have written about. It's in some of the results from our research. We have discussions about this in the recovery portion of the book, and in our Living Recovery program. So, we've been very vocal and trying to be vocal about this. I've tried to be vocal about it with bloggers. So I don't see them, getting on the message. So I thought I would take it directly to the survivors, that you need to understand what makes your trauma worse. And some of that is this issue about non-trauma informed care and not disengaging enough from what is triggering. Those stories, all of that, all of the memories, the stories, the feelings, the emotions, all of that are so important and so highly activated that they deserve to be processed in a trauma session with a trauma therapist, so that you are not re-traumatized by your own content. So that's what I have to say about the issue of no contact. It's really the issue of disengagement, that once you have gone no contact, you should immediately also be in this disengagement with other things that remind you and keep you in emotional contact with him and memory contact with him. And as long as you are activating those parts with emotional contact and memory contact, you are not no contact. So if we can be of any help to you, our website is saferelationshipsmagazine.com. If you click on Your Recovery Starts Here, there's a drop down. Click on the Living Recovery program, which is our trauma-informed care, trauma reduction, affordable online program run by myself, a trauma therapist from decades. So, and also, if you are looking or need a trauma-informed Facebook page that is not re-triggering and it is not going to place you back into emotional and memory contact with him, our Facebook group is the Institute for Relational Harm Reduction. If you are new into recovery, we have a free ebook on our website, saferelationshipsmagazine.com. It's on the right-hand side. It's called the Early Recovery Guide, and it's an ebook, and it talks exactly about this, about the issues of trauma worsening, and the 4 things that survivors often do that wreck their recovery. So go by, get that, it's free. Join me back here as I continue to chip away at some of the problems emerging, unfortunately, in what could have been a really great new genre of counseling. Hopefully we'll get it cleaned up. Thanks for joining me. It's been Sandra Brown with the Institute.